Hello and welcome to this, the seventh in our series of P2 webinars. And today we're going to be looking at a bit of P2 that we don't often shout about, but it's part that's very integral to what we do here at P2, and that's P2 FinCrime. Because today we're going to be talking about the challenging world of financial crime transformation, having a look at some of the regulations, some of the activities that are involved in large-scale transformation. Those of you who've joined us before know that we'll be talking for about half an hour. We generally don't have time for questions, but we do answer your questions, so do feel free to write in any questions you might have, and we do respond within 24 hours. And today, of course, we're joined with a very special guest. We're joined by the CEO of P2 and P2 FinCrime, and in fact, my boss, Phil Rolfe. Phil, hi.
Good afternoon, Adam.
Thank you for joining us. And of course, I'm Adam Skinner, Director of Consulting. So, Phil, FinCrime, what is the big idea? What is the big deal?
I guess it seeks to address the challenges of combating financial crime around the world. And principally, the principal area is trying to stop the criminals changing their proceeds of crime into ones and zeros and getting them into the banking organizations, because that way they can ship their money all around the world. What you can see on the slide in front of you is a great example of the fact that cash is pretty much useless in most situations. $259 million found in a Mexican garage as part of a drugs check. And this money, was destined for the banking system, but didn't get there. Once it's in the system, it can start to move around the world much easier. So the principal driver for a large aspect of financial crime is trying to stop the proceeds of crime actually reaching the systems around the world.
And it's a pretty prevalent challenge, as this slide shows.
Yes, this is just the last 10 years. In terms of fines, and it only looks at the US fines as well. It would have been a much busier slide if we tried to get everything on. So there are some fairly hefty numbers on there. I was actually working for RBS, having acquired ABN AMRO back in 2010. So you can see us on the left-hand side with a fairly chunky 500 million. And it's ebbed and flowed since then, to be honest. Some years stronger than others, depending on when the conclusion of the fines, etc., come through.
Was there a particular oh my god moment out of any of these that particularly stands out to you?
I think the HSBC, because it was the first one to be over $1 billion in 2012, and then the one that blew the doors off was the BNP Paribas 8.9 billion in 2014. And whilst the fines have fallen a little since then, they're still pretty strong. And the US in particular appear to be coming back on with some Standard Chartered fine last year of 650 odd million. So not the sort of numbers that you would notice on any balance sheet, to be honest.
Okay. And what drew sort of you and P2 to FinCrime? Why was this such an interesting area for us?
I was given the opportunity to start in 2009 when RBS took over ABN AMRO, and ABN had a really good team in the Netherlands. I was asked to go and learn what we could from them and spread it around the rest of the RBS estates, which we did. And it's just a really interesting area. The criminals try very, very hard to get into to launder their money and move their money around. And so it's an area that's constantly changing, and we need to be sort of on the front foot. I was lucky enough to run my business for a year or so, focused on financial crime, working with a couple of big organizations, then bumped into P2. And we've sort of worked in that space ever since. And it's the benefit of being a small consultancy means that we can really listen to our clients and understand what the problems are, and then help them solve those problems, as opposed to selling them stuff off the shelf, which some of the bigger organizations tend to do. Okay. And that's really why we're invited back again and again, is to help our clients to fix things, which is great.
Great stuff. So I've decided to transform my organization to meet a new financial crime regulation. What's different about that challenge? Why is it not just the same as any other large-scale organizational transformation?
I think transformations themselves are hard enough. You've just got the overlay of a number of different aspects. Technology is constantly evolving in this space. The criminals are innovating, and the big technology providers and some of the smaller ones are looking at new ways of solving those problems, identifying the criminals around the world. So technology does move quite fast. As we said before, the criminal attack vectors are constantly changing. They're constantly probing the system all around the world. And once they find a weakness, that creates value, not just because they can move their own funds that way, but they can sell that access point as well. So once there's a weakness identified in an organization, it will be exploited because it will be sold. The regulations are constantly evolving, as are the guidance and best practices. And so you can't just fix it and then sit back and reap the rewards. You are constantly trying to keep up with the new learnings, etc. And any organization will be subject to cost pressure. And when you're talking about people and technology, you know, the return on investment is always in the background. These aren't just for fun. We do this to secure organizations and to look after the customers, but there has to be a sensible investment path.
So some very unique drivers sort of driving the pace of change and the need to change, but also this incredibly difficult balancing act between what is regulatory transformation, but also the cost of the investment into that, which people are obviously trying to keep as low as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. So you've got these particularly challenging drivers. What's particularly difficult then about the FinCrime regulation implementation?
So again, once you've sort of decided to change, there are a number of decisions to be made, and they are complicated and challenging decisions. There's always a drive to fix things quickly, and those tactical solutions may help you for the now, but you really need a roadmap for the longer term solutions as well. You can't just keep patching things together. So there's a real playoff between one and the other that organizations have to battle with. We've spoken before about the competition. The other organizations will be investing in this space, and if you're not careful, you fall off the back of the pack and you will be exploited if you end up in that space. Organizations are very customer centric and trying to make the customer journeys as simple and straightforward as possible. But when you've got regulatory compliance in the background, it's a very tricky juggling act to make sure you're compliant and not making the customer journey an absolute nightmare. There's a tendency to look at big solutions for organizations. The big vendors are always out there, but these programs can take many years to deliver, and organizations often don't have that amount of time to wait to fix a problem. They kind of have to do it now. And whilst we've all worked with fantastic teams around the world who help us with that sort of frontline manual support, there's that drive to automate where possible without reducing the control. So all these factors kind of play into this space, making the sort of central decision to transform quite challenging and quite dynamic.
And I understand it's a uniquely complicated architecture as well. I mean, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is what's sort of termed the house. And whilst it's, you know, there are a lot of aspects to it, it just seeks to demonstrate really the layers of complexity. And if you don't solve in a logical way, you can end up in trouble. So you really do need to talk about your governance and set your risk appetite, and then define your overarching policies for each of these aspects. And they are, you know, some are more important than others, but each need to be considered, from AML to ABC to tax transparency. You've got your customer risk assessment on the left-hand side, which really sets out how you're evaluating your customers across your various different models and applying the different classifications. On the right, you've got the guidance, which often sits on the very front line. This is the stuff that the frontline teams will be using day to day. And in the middle, you've got your standards, which feed from the policy and set the next level down of detail. You don't really want your policies to have everything in, because then you're constantly having to change them. You want the policies to set the overarching picture, and then the standards to go into more detail, and the guidance to provide your sort of your day-to-day things. On the left, you've got your sort of whole bank-wide risk assessment piece and your divisional risk assessments. And on the right, you're looking forward, horizon scanning, and you're providing MI and analytics inwards and upwards and outwards to the various different stakeholders, all underpinned by the 3 lines of defense model and your financial crime assurance framework. So it just kind of demonstrates in its, you know, we could expand this probably another level, but it shows some of the layers of complexity across the financial crime landscape.
And for those who aren't familiar, do you want to expand a bit on the 3 lines of defense operating model?
Yeah, I think the 3 lines of defense is a fairly standard. Now you've got your first line, which is the frontline execution. So the people who are pressing the buttons, and they have a set of responsibilities to try and identify issues and have their own controls. The The second line is often a compliance-led function, which is overseeing the front line and making sure they're following the control frameworks and maybe doing some testing to make sure we're following procedures. And ultimately, then you've got internal audit on the third line, which are dip checking all the way down through second and first to make sure the whole control framework is standing up and identifying issues and managing them appropriately.
Great stuff, great stuff. So I think I'm now going to walk us through the top 5 common mistakes that you've come across in your career working on large-scale financial crime implementation. Where do we start?
So we've looked at some common mistakes across the piece. There's a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver. Once a set of issues are identified and they started to be discussed with the regulator, there's a real drive to start to kind of set dates and tell the regulator when you're going to do things by. And often this is done in a real rush because of the spotlight of the regulators is there. Whereas time spent planning with the right people inputting to it will mean that you have a much more robust plan going forward. The regulator wants you to get through this and come out the other side and be stable and successful. They don't want you to promise dates that you can't achieve. So allowing a sensible amount of time to do this work up front will mean that you can set your deliverables out and you'll actually gain confidence within your own team and actually with the regulator because you won't be failing to deliver to a plan that was made up. You'll have something that you can actually stand on and then achieve over a sensible period of time.
And in your experience, the regulatory bodies are eminently reasonable. They're groups that you can go and have these discussions with quite openly about what can be achieved and over what timescales.
Yeah, I mean, they've been through this numerous times with numerous organisations, and they see again and again plans coming and plans going, and massive changes once people actually understand the challenges. So it's not new to them. It's definitely possible to have a conversation and say, look, we need some time to plan this properly, and then give you a plan that we can stick to and deliver to.
Okay, great. So we've spoken to the regulator, we've agreed a plan. What happens next?
So there's again a tendency, because the financial crime is quite a complex space, as we've seen before. There is a tendency to try and fix everything at once. So you've identified the issues, and it may be filtering, screening, monitoring, list and rules. And there's a drive, often from the senior in the organisation, to actually, when can we fix all of this? And the right thing to do is to take a risk-based approach and prioritise the change. If you're not careful, you run out of space under the bonnet in terms of technology and change capacity, and everything becomes a bit of a mess. Whereas prioritising the change and organising them in a logical way, with some overlaps, it'll mean that you'll reduce the log jams, and the organisation and potentially your customers can absorb the changes as they come through. So it's resisting that temptation to try and fix everything immediately, but standing back and saying, where are our main risks? We should attack that first and then move forward in a logical order.
And does that risk-based approach have to be a very large activity? Can it be quite tight and focused?
No, I mean, the risks around financial crime are pretty well known and well documented. Sanctions is there, payments is quite high, and then at the other end, negative news would be towards the end. So there's a fairly standard way of evaluating the risk. You don't have to go away for a long time. You can use the proven models, really.
Great stuff. So I've used a risk-based approach. I've got my priority order all ready to go. Presumably now I'm ready to dive straight in and start fixing stuff immediately.
Yeah, and that would be the next one. So there is a tendency under pressure from sponsors and regulators to get on and do everything, start immediately. And the challenge there is if you've got 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 files to remediate, and you start now, you'll often be improving your policy at the same time. And what inevitably happens is you'll get 6 or 9 months in, and your policy will be rewritten and nice and shiny and new, but the 10, 20, 50,000 files that you've already remediated will need to be re-remediated because you've now got a new policy. So again, looking at the logical order, allowing the policy to be rewritten, and that feeding into remediations, feeding into target operating models, etc., will mean that you won't have to go back and start again. It's not counterintuitive, but it is challenging to hold back on progress in some areas to ensure you've completed the steps in the right order.
So I've coordinated my approach and I've focused on my policies. What goes wrong next?
There are many vendors out there, and all of us will have been through large-scale technology change where the sort of 3 to 5 year program has promised to deliver the Earth and unfortunately hasn't. And often it's because the requirements change as we go through. So there really is an opportunity to seek, once you've identified specific issues, to apply technology to those issues in a very targeted way. Don't be tempted to buy the overarching solutions, because they will take an awful long time to connect, and it also means you're tied in for a very long time to try and get some sort of payback. So maybe looking at targeted solutions and connecting them via APIs or some of the newer technology means that you can actually fix specific issues with specific solutions, rather than hoping that your big architecture fix is going to deliver in 5, 7, 8 years time.
And presumably that ties in with taking a risk-based approach, so understanding exactly where you need to target in the policies before you even want to start thinking about these solutions towards the end.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many more vendors out there. There's a bit of a blizzard, to be honest, but some stand out, having built up a track record now to be able to compete against the traditional players.
Great stuff. So, what's your fifth and final common mistake?
These programs will attract significant investment. They will be multi-year. They may have 10 or hundreds of millions behind them. And what tends to happen is other problems will gravitate towards them. And if you're not careful, your program will be hijacked by other historic problems seeking a vehicle to provide solutions, and get bogged down and diverted. So it's really key that once you've got your scope, once you've got your deliverables, once you've agreed your outcomes, that you are absolutely rigorous with the change control around them. You don't need bells or whistles. Whilst this isn't quite minimum viable product, it's got to be achievable. You're much better off having something delivered and then build out from that than keep adding to the scope and never deliver anything, which is an absolute classic challenge from big organizations.
Yeah, and actually outside the FinCrime world as well, that challenge of the never-ending program just tends to sort of hit every single organization I've been with over my time. Great. So 5 key common mistakes: overpromising and underdeliver, trying to change everything at once, starting to fix stuff immediately, believing the hype, and assuming that a particular program is a panacea for all else. So some classic stuff that can go wrong. How do we at P2 help people make sure it goes right?
So I guess we've got really good experience with a number of organizations over the last 10 plus years in terms of who we've got involved, and we can help in a number of ways. It's really from the off. Once you identify an issue or you have regulatory engagement, you need to be very well structured and planned in the way that you respond. You effectively need a gateway in between yourself and the regulator, so you don't have random areas of the organization responding. You need pushback sometimes, so some questions will have been answered before. So it's having that central point, a small office or person who can act as the gatekeeper, and making sure that you are being considered in your response, because you will then ultimately have to deliver, and asking for more time so that you can come back with a sensible answer versus responding to a timescale which may well have been made up in the first place is a great place to start. If you build confidence in the regulator early on in the way you engage, that will stand you in good stead in future. Looking at the improvements in an end-to-end way and connecting everything together, making sure you're considering as part of your approach the people who are ultimately at the center of this activity, and trying to seek ways of making the boat go faster, to quote one of the Olympic guys, and making sure that each element you put in is moving you in the right direction, versus if you have to go off at a tangent, it's understood why, and if that's a tactical piece, how that works. There are some key aspects around the platforms themselves, and caution in selecting them, and then investing time in testing them, and ultimately tuning and integrating them are significant effort, but if done right can pay massive dividends back into the organization in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. I guess the operating model itself, which can be very complex, breaking it down into constituent parts and making sure that you do enough design work up front to allow you to move forward, so that each element as it lands in the right place, and you end up with the right people, doing the right work and aiming at the right outcomes. And I guess we sit across all of those and support advisory work as well as the actual execution and follow through activity as well. And I guess that's the good thing about us, is that we've actually operated in all of those areas.
And actually, Phil, we've had a question which actually ties quite nicely into this slide. So a question's come in that says, what are the plus and minuses of buying one big solution against a range of niche products? Do you have any advice about someone who's facing up into that challenge?
Yeah, one big solution will take you an awful long time to put in, because you've got to unplumb a lot of smaller platforms. So if you're looking at one of the major players, they'll try and cover fraud, AML, ABC, sanctions, etc. So you will have current systems, processes, controls in each of those places, which will need to be replaced in order for you to get the benefit of an overarching platform. So there are benefits to that if you've got a lot of money and a lot of time. So you'd probably be in a stable environment and looking to get there within 5 to 7 years.
Okay.
The targeted solutions are likely to deliver quicker. And that's really the key to it. So if you've got a real problem, then you may well be better in investing in a specific solution to solve that problem, and then looking at the medium and long term as to how they knit together.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So Phil, you often talk about the importance of people in fin crime, making your people are correctly accredited and trained. Do you want to share a little bit about P2 and actually our approach to ensuring that people are properly accredited and trained?
Yes, we were lucky enough to be asked by one organisation to help them with their financial crime training programme, and we've built it up over a number of years now, had over 500 people go through, and we've actually trained from executive board level right down to front line, and the training is tailored. Whilst it started face to face and we were running sort of half days up to 5-day classes, we're now running it all online. We've just completed another tranche of our academy online with 20 people who passed with a combination of, I can check actually, merits and passes of the 20 that recently went through, which is brilliant. And it just gives people the confidence to understand the breadth of the topic. It also means they're talking the same language. If you're pulling a team together to achieve it, to drive a change program, they will come from all of the big organizations, Deutsche, HSBC, Barclays, RBS, NatWest, Standard Chartered. They will all have their own language. They will all have their own way of doing things. And so putting them through some kind of training program will align it in your organization's way, which is what we see as the main benefit coming out.
And how do you vary that engagement between the executive board and the front line? Are you trying to do something different with the training, or is it essentially the same training you're trying to give?
I think the underlying messages are the same. You've got a very different audience. So the executive has got different responsibilities as well, which they're often not necessarily aware of, despite the SMR activity that's going on at the moment. So at the top level, we're just trying to explain what can happen when it goes wrong, give them examples of other boards and what's happened there in terms of losing control, because the regulator may come in and impose a skilled person on a board, which starts demanding to see activity. So that's the key for the board. Whereas the front line, you're just trying to explain what decisions they can make, what decisions they can escalate, what the common problems and challenges are, and get them used to the terminology and confident in being able to understand the different routes that criminals will take and the weaknesses that they try and exploit.
Great stuff. So training accreditation, absolutely critical for any fin crime implementation. So a range of really interesting clients here. Is there any particular case studies you wanted to draw out that showed that, what we've been talking about?
Yeah, because these are all the historic clients that we've worked with. We've got some that are live at the moment, which are deliberately not on here. We worked with one of the big European banks. We started as part of the design authority, as they were under significant regulatory scrutiny from UK, European and US regulators. So we helped them design that initial target operating model. We then went on to run a couple of big work streams where they were replatforming their name screening and transaction monitoring systems. So we kind of flowed through from supporting the design phase with technical input to actually the execution phase, where we were driving implementations across multiple jurisdictions. And I guess that's part of what we can bring, is that our team members have been there and done that. So we've operated in some of the organizations. We've been there at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to get a system live. We've been there at, over the weekend trying to write an executive report that's got to get through risk committee. So our consultants tend to have been there and done that, and are therefore very comfortable working alongside clients with our sleeves rolled up, actually getting things done, as opposed to some of the more ivory tower consultants that will sit in the corner and direct traffic and ultimately not necessarily add any value. I think that's what we find, is we're often asked to come in and replace other consultants who have been doing stuff for quite a long time, but there hasn't been much output. So when a client realizes they actually need to get stuff done, that's often when we'll get the call, and we'll bring the team in and start to work alongside them to achieve that.
Great stuff. And for the people listening, what's the next big thing they should be worrying about in this space? What's the next big thing that's coming charging towards us?
Well, I think all this COVID stuff is going to bring a number of different vectors. There will be a whole new raft of criminals coming in, but ultimately they will be trying to extract money from people and then bounce that money around sufficiently to be able to hide it. So underlying is still doing good quality KYC, really knowing who your customers are and maintaining that knowledge, and then looking for patterns, because often the criminals will now use an existing channel and try and corrupt that channel, be it an individual or an organization, because the hard work of getting the account open has already been done. So if they can corrupt the channel, they can start to flow their funds through. And that's where some of the newer players, the Arachnius and others, are sort of sitting in that space where they're really good at looking for the patterns that are coming through. So yeah, the Quantex are in that space as well. Big data crunchers. It's very difficult to spot patterns with sort of old style systems where you're trying to write specific targeted research, whereas Quantex will just sit on the top and just look for patterns and use their algorithms to spot those. So that's a really interesting space where the big data companies can add value.
Great stuff. Well, as we're coming a bit close to the end now, if you wanted people listening to take one thing away, what would that be?
I guess it's just to consider us when you're looking at your next program. We're very happy to go up against the big players, and I think you tend to find that we can really talk about what we've done, how we've helped, and how we've worked in organizations and made big changes, how we've replaced platforms and what we've learned. And working with vendors, there's often a defensive and attack sort of strategy with vendors, whereas actually if you have the confidence to work with them, you'll get much more out of them much faster. And we're going to talk to one of them at some point in future and try and get their tips and hints as well. So I think it's that it's give us an opportunity to work with you, and based on what we've done historically, we can really make a difference to your program and ultimately helping you achieve it faster and close those risks quicker.
Great stuff. Well, listen, Phil, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts. We're about out of time now. So as ever, I'll just close by saying we'll be sharing the slides with all attendees. Do feel free to drop us any questions you have on these subjects. You can see our details there. Equally, do feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn. We're always happy to chat. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time on the 25th of June to talk about program planning, mapping the future, program planning in a waterfall or agile world, which should be a really interesting discussion, something very close to my heart. So hope you had a really useful half hour and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Adam. Cheers. Bye.